The Government of India Act 1919 was a significant constitutional development in British India, marking a pivotal step towards self-governance. It is also known as the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, named after the Secretary of State for India, Lord Montagu, and the Viceroy, Lord Chelmsford, who played a key role in its formulation. The Act introduced reforms that aimed to address the growing demand for Indian participation in governance and to lay the foundation for constitutional reforms leading to full independence. Key provisions of the Government of India Act 1919. 1. Diarchy, dual government. System. The Act introduced a diarchy system at the provincial level, which divided the powers of governance between elected Indian ministers and appointed British officials. The powers were divided into two categories. Reserved subjects. These were under the control of the British governor and included areas like law and order, finance, and military affairs. Transferred subjects. These were subject to Indian ministers and included education, health, local government, and agriculture. 2. Provincial Legislative Councils. The Act expanded the legislative councils at the provincial level and introduced elected representatives for the first time. However, the majority of the members was still appointed by the British government, and the franchise was limited to a small percentage of the population. The legislative councils could discuss laws and policies, but their power was limited as the final authority rested with the British government. 3. Central Legislative Assembly. A bicameral system was introduced at the centre with the establishment of the Central Legislative Assembly, Lower House, and the Council of State, Upper House. The Central Legislative Assembly had 145 members, with 42 elected and 104 appointed, while the Council of State had 60 members. The Assembly was given the power to pass laws, but the Governor-General retained the veto power, and any law could be overridden by the British government. 4. Expansion of the franchise. The Act expanded the electorate to include a larger number of people, although it still remained limited by property, income, and educational qualifications. The electorate was about 10–15% of the population. 5. Governor-General's powers. The Governor-General retained substantial powers under the Act. The Governor-General had control over important areas such as defense, foreign affairs, and the appointment of key officials, and could also dissolve the Legislative Assembly. The Governor-General could use the reserved subjects to exercise discretionary powers without consulting the elected Indian ministers. 6. Indian Councils Act of 1909, Morley-Minto reforms, was further strengthened, allowing for more Indian participation in legislative processes, although the real power continued to remain in the hands of the British. 7. Rights of Indians. The Act made some attempts to increase the rights and representation of Indian citizens, but it was still heavily restricted and controlled by the British. It allowed for the establishment of a High Commissioner for India in London to represent Indian interests. Significance of the Government of India Act, 1919. 1. Step towards self-governance. The Act marked a significant step towards constitutional reforms and the development of self-governance for India. It introduced limited Indian representation in governance and made provision for Indian ministers in some areas of governance. 2. Growth of nationalist sentiment. While the Act was seen by some as a step forward, it was widely criticized for not granting full self-rule or independence. It led to an increase in nationalist demands for complete self-rule, especially as the Indian National Congress and other political parties began to demand more powers and representation. 3. Foundation for future reforms. The Government of India Act, 1919, laid the groundwork for further constitutional changes, which would eventually lead to the Government of India Act, 1935, and later, India's independence in 1947. 4. Initiation of the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms. The Act set the stage for the Montagu-Chelmsford Reforms, which aimed to modernize India's governance and address the political demands of the Indian population for self-rule. 5. Limitation of Indian autonomy. The diarchy system was criticized for its inefficiency, as the division of power between British and Indian officials often led to conflict and a lack of cohesive governance at the provincial level. 6. Impact on future legislative reforms. The Act influenced later legislative changes, including the formation of a bicameral legislature and electoral reforms. However, it failed to provide the autonomy that many Indians had hoped for, leading to growing dissatisfaction with British rule. Conclusion. The Government of India Act 1919 was a milestone in the constitutional history of India. While it did provide for some degree of self-governance, it was a compromise, heavily influenced by British control and interests. It was a significant step in the constitutional evolution of India, though it fell short of granting full autonomy. It sowed the seeds for future political and constitutional movements, ultimately leading to India's independence in 1947.